Aviation of WW1 by Zach Morris, Matt Strauss, John Schutte, and Mark Latto. World War I dogfight tactics. In 1914, the Germans began using planes for short-range reconnaissance on France. In late 1914, the Royal Navy Air Service made an attack on Germany. They used a simple strategy by carrying small bomb loads and small aircrafts as the only cargo. Then in December of 1914, Germany fired back with an air raid of the English Channel. Reconnaissance planes began to receive attacks from enemy defense bases. Bricks, grenades, and other blunt objects were thrown at reconnaissance plane, hoping to bring the engine down. Rope was thrown to try to get it caught in the propeller and bring the plane down. Attempts to bring down reconnaissance planes led to pilots beginning to carry their own handguns for protection. Pilots with firearms sparked aerial battles. Dogfights became a major staple of World War I. Two-seater planes surfaced as a result of this. The British began mounting machine guns and Maxim guns on their planes. This slowed planes down, and they had to use tougher planes instead of fast ones. More powerful models later came out, and planes with built-in firearms became dominant. One tactic used by the British had the pilot facing backwards on the plane, in order to better handle a machine gun. They also experimented with mounting a gun under the propeller. French pilots began adding deflector plates to the propeller. German air forces flew in large V-shaped formations. This allowed them to have attacking planes and defending planes. Other tactics that originated in World War I include the famous loop-de-loop, a cloud cover strategy, which uses the clouds as cover for the pilot's routes, and tracer ammunition, which allowed the pilot to adjust his aim for his gun every 7th shot. And now for Mark Latto's interview with Mr. Bedore.
What were like the big plane designs, like plane manufacturers?
The big ones for the Germans were the Fokkers. That's the main, and I'm not sure who designed. I know in France, you had Bobs, and in England you had Sopwith. But I'm not sure. Fokker is actually both a designation and the manufacturer. I'm not sure if Sopwith is the designation. It is a designation. I'm not sure if it's also a manufacturer. I'm not sure if there's a company called Sopwith, like the Sopwith Camel when it's playing. So I assume that it is, but I don't know that for a fact.
Zeppelins, you always hear stories about that. What were those used for?
Bombing. The Germans used them. I mean, the other countries experimented with them, but the Germans were the ones who really used them into combat, and they were actually used for long-range bombing. It's the first long-range aerial bombing in history. They brought them over to England, and they bombed England from the air. And they were not effective. I mean, tactically speaking, they were not enormously effective. But as a quote-unquote terror weapon, they were. The other thing about them was military planners could see where that was going. In other words, everybody started trying to develop or was thinking about planes that could carry large loads, move faster, and make that kind of distance. And that was the difference. The Zeppelin could make that kind of distance. The airplanes couldn't.
Who are the big pilots?
Oh boy! Well, you got Richthofen. That's the German. That's the Red Baron. You had Eddie Brown in America. He's an American, and nobody French or English is leaping to mind. But that the key to understand there generally is that the pilot that was the glamour role. They were literally, all of them were sort of national heroes. They were seen as knights because it was cutting-edge technology. It was brand new. The idea that you could fly, let alone fly in combat, made them really glamorous. In that war, nothing other than the pilots. They were really glamorous and, rock stars. They had kind of rock star status. So, Rickenbacker, that's another one.
Okay, now, apparently it all started with observation balloons. How simple were those?
Well, if you go early enough back, the first observation balloons are used in, Europe before even the turn of the century. So they were insanely simple, right? Just literally a hot air balloon. It's like anything else, they got increasingly sophisticated as time went by. They were used in the American Civil War to some extent, although not broadly. But so the earliest are as simple a hot air balloon as you can imagine, literally tethered to the ground because they don't even have the capability of effectively steering it, which is not a good thing in a combat situation.
Yeah. All right, now machine guns being mounted on planes. It took them a long time to figure out the whole propeller thing. And
yeah, the Germans did it first. Originally, the machine guns were mounted on the upper wing, so that you're firing over, right? But that's an aiming problem because now the think about it, the plane or whatever you want to call it, the angle the machine gun's firing at is actually above the aiming point of the pilot. So then they tried a lot of experiments with moving them down directly in front of the pilot, where they'd have the gun sight right here, and they did some weird things. Like the French had little metal deflectors on the propellers, because you're literally shooting through the propeller and it's supposed to bounce off it. They'd shoot right through the propeller and the plane would go down. The Germans eventually figured out a mechanism where the engine was connected to the machine gun, basically, a mechanical mechanism. And it would only fire when the space between the propeller blades was in front of it.
yeah.
Yeah, and then, it's not difficult technology, so everybody had it by the end of the war.
And were there any like actual bombers that were airplanes?
Oh, sure, yes. Yeah, in particular, again, the Germans. The earliest bombers were literally guys bringing up, like hand grenades and handheld bombs and leaning up the side of the plane and dropping them by hand. Again, not particularly effective. They did develop some bombers. The problem, though, that they had, and then towards the end of the war, the problem that they had, though, is you're talking about machines that are made out of wood and canvas. Right? And the lift capability of those planes was not, by our standards, was minuscule. So the problem is both aiming the bomb, that's part of it, but then also, how do you get a machine that can lift that much ordnance, enough ordnance to be an effective bomber into the air? They really didn't have that. So the bombing tended to be very sporadic, and again, much like the Zeppelin, it didn't make it much of a tactical difference, but everybody could see where it was going. So that was clear. That was very clear. So as soon as the war is over, everybody just, except the Germans, because they're forbidden, verboten, they're all experimenting with trying to get heavier and heavier planes, so there's more and more loads.
Yeah, that definitely kept the Germans safe.
Oh yeah, well, a little bit. Okay.
World War I pilots. The life expectancy of pilots during World War I was only about 40 to 60 hours. The first ever recorded pilot to do a loop-de-loop was Roland Garros. The greatest pilot known in World War I was Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. He shot down 80 planes while in battle, and was a pilot for Germany. Most pilots during World War I were geared up with a leather flying helmet, goggles, a scarf, and a leather overcoat. It was very cold up in the air, so pilots had to dress very warm. The scarf worn around the neck was to prevent chafing. Aside from the primary weaponry, most pilots were equipped with pistols to shoot at other planes. Some even had rifles while flying, although this made it more difficult to fly. Dehydration became a problem while spending long periods of time up in the air, so pilots brought on canteens for water. Parachutes were first used by the Germans. Other countries started to follow this trend later on in the war. Pilots were the least equipped soldiers on the battlefield. Aircraft. One aircraft flown by Britain was the Sopwith Camel. It was dangerous to learn to fly with it, but when used right, it was excellent in the hand of a skilled pilot. It had twin Vickers machine guns, which could carry up to 4 20-pound bombs. It was by far the most successful aircraft in the war. The Fokker D-7 was most often associated with the Germans. It was the best all-around German fighter, extremely easy to fly, and had no problems for beginners. The Allies had so much respect for this machine that, in the terms of the armistice, it was specifically ordered to surrender all of these aircrafts. It was also mounted with 2 Spandau synchronized guns fired through the revolving propeller. The Spad 7 was a French plane. It was fast, reliable, and able to sustain considerable damage and still survive. At some points in their careers, nearly all French aces flew the Spads, and they had 1 Vickers machine gun on each.